I want to start by thanking, of course, Jana and Randy for organizing this event, but I feel sort of, we couldn't have a Mormon gathering without some tears. I feel very overwhelmed by the gift Claudia has given us with these oral histories. It's such an important project. And for her ability as just a senior scholar in our field, bringing these voices into the room here today of these Mormon women speaking from a diversity of perspectives, I just really want to acknowledge the work she's done and say how moving I find it and how grateful I am for it. And now I'm going to stop crying, or try. And I should say, too, that I have my own personal narrative of Prop 8, and I wrote about it in a book I've just published. And there's a few copies outside. You can get one if you want. I'm going to try and talk today, even though I lived in California and during the time of the Yes on 8 campaign. I'm going to try and talk today as a scholar, sort of trying to analytically tease out different threads I saw and put them together with larger patterns in Mormon history and culture to help make sense of what exactly it was that we experienced that fall. Okay, so just for some background, Proposition 8 was a 2008 ballot initiative that successfully amended the California state constitution to abolish existing rights of same-sex couples to marry civilly. Although the real muscle, and I want to be clear about this, the real muscle behind Proposition 8 was homophobia, right? Statewide, general, everybody, homophobia. Mormons played a dominant role in the Yes on 8 campaign. In June 2008, a letter from the First Presidency of the Church was read over the pulpit during Sunday sacrament meetings, asking members to, quote, do all you can in support of Proposition 8 to abolish same-sex marriage. By late August 2008, the Church had organized selective solicitation conference calls wherein members of the Quorum of the 70, a high-ranking body of Mormon officials, asked potential large donors to give $25,000 per family to protectmarriage.com. After a surge in five-figure donations began to appear on state donor records in early September, large and small-scale giving continued, so that by the end of the campaign, it is estimated that individual Mormons who make up 2% of California's population contributed between 50 and 70% of the $40 million raised by Yes on 8. LDS congregations had also been mobilized as precinct walkers, phone bankers, zip code area supervisors, and child care providers in voter identification and get-out-the-vote efforts for a far-reaching and professionally orchestrated grassroots campaign. In many areas of California, Mormons constituted the majority of the on-the-ground grassroots political operation, while Mormons as far away as Massachusetts were solicited for donations, and members as far away as Idaho readied to participate in phone banks. After a contentious 5-month campaign that cost $83 million, the most expensive social policy initiative in United States history, Proposition 8 passed by a margin of about 52 to 48%. Why this intensity? How did Mormons understand our own participation in the Yes on 8 campaign? We've heard David Campbell speak earlier today about Mormon populations as dry kindling and attributing their ready mobilization to the strongly centralized hierarchical organization of the church and emphasis on obedience to LDS church leadership. But not every socially conservative cause elicits such a response from LDS church members. What happened with Proposition 8 was that LDS church officials and Mormon political operatives successfully particularized the Yes on 8 campaign in terms of LDS theology and historical experience. LDS people were led to experience Proposition 8 as an assault by broader society on what Mormons had for more than a century perceived to be an imperiled form, the Mormon temple marriage. This triggered century-old tensions between Mormons and American civil society over questions of family definition, theocracy, and state sovereignty, tensions that revealed themselves in the discourse of the campaign. Today I'm going to examine how patterns of discourse first developed among Mormons during open conflict over polygamy have shaped Mormon participation in American political life, including the Yes on 8 campaign. And just aside, I think I just polygamy, I had an early version of this paper note that I just think polygamy is as to Mormon history as slavery is to American history. It's pervasive, it's foundational, it's pervasive, it's persistent in its effects. It's still very much with us, even though it's not necessarily acknowledged as such. According to anthropologist Damon Smith, polygamy fostered the development of discursive strategies, ways of talking and thinking, used by Mormons to maintain their theocratic sovereignty in the face of federal colonization. Working from Smith, I identify 5 discursive strategies. 1, theological and discursive construction of the temple-sealed family as a unit of LDS theocracies, with LDS temples as its emblem. 2, preference for information through authorized channels and general distrust of non-institutional sources on Mormonism. 3, adoption of a defensive default posture of non-transparency in public relations, a stance captured in the phrase, mind your own business, also known in the late 19th century as the Mormon Creed. Number 4, cultivation of insider and outsider narratives. And number 5, the use of carefully managed public speech to protect private knowledge. I call this complex of discursive tactics undergrounding, after the 19th century Mormon underground that harbored Mormon men and women evading prosecution for polygamy or unlawful cohabitation. Even after the polygamy crisis years passed, these tactics of undergrounding contributed to the development of a Mormon ethos privileging opacity, institutional loyalty, hierarchy, and guardedness as assimilating LDS communities maintained their residual theocratic difference. And maybe later we can talk about guardedness and opacity in a certain presidential candidate. The kernel of this undergrounding strategy is this: a split between private or insider communication and public communication that manifests in practices of social insularity, Mormons preferring to marry, socialize, discuss faith with other Mormons, and in the careful use of public speech as sort of a protective or deflective action rather than communicative reason, the assumed speech norm of modern civic lives, right? So that, the social compact modernity agrees on is that we speak. It doesn't always work this way, but we think of speech as being communicative and rational and supposed to convey something. A different sense of speech obtains, I'm suggesting, in some Mormon situations where public speech is actually management of private information, sort of deflection and management of private information. Mormon studies scholars continue to speak about this public-private split, contributing to a divided sense of self among Mormons, and related habits of double coding in public speech, especially in situations where LDS people perceive a threat to their way of being. That's how California Mormons were led to view the legalization of same-sex marriage, the construction of the Yes on 8 campaign as a last-ditch defense of LDS temple marriage practices, reactivated Mormon discursive tactics of undergrounding developed under the pressure of the 19th century battle of polygamy. I'm going to review some of these attributes of this Mormon sort of discursive habits and how they manifest and materialize during Proposition 8. First, preference for information through authorized channel and general distrust of non-institutional sources on Mormonism. The Yes on 8 campaign, the LDS Yes on 8 campaign, operationalized Mormon preference for information through authorized LDS channels and distrust of non-institutional sources, a pattern that dates back to polygamy. Mormons did not receive their information about Proposition 8 through general campaign media. Instead, specifically Mormon campaign content was developed and distributed through familiar institutional channels: letters over the pulpit, instructions from priesthood leaders and congregations, and donation solicitation and video conference training by members of the Quorum of the 70. A second set of surrogate institutional channels bearing a trusted conservative LDS brand was also established, particularly through conservative online LDS Meridian magazine. A third set of trusted insider channels during the campaign were Mormon kinship networks, families, friends, wards, and reporter McKay Coppins has a great piece out in BuzzFeed today about how the Romney campaign is kind of using some of these networks among Mormons, the Friends and Family Network, to turn out volunteers, which horizontally distributed discourse and argumentation through face-to-face and online interaction. So effective were these horizontal kinship networks that during their October 8 teleconference training, LDS church officials encouraged members to use this horizontal messaging. Institutional channels, branded surrogates, and kinship networks all served as the primary trusted source of information for LDS people during the Yes on 8 campaign. public sources were disregarded or regarded with distrust. Number 2, adoption of a default defensive posture of non-transparency in public relations, aka mind your own business. Second, the church established through its surrogates a defensive organizational posture of public non-transparency, the operational equivalent of the mind your own business creed. Just as authorized campaign communications were fed into Mormon communities through LDS institutional and surrogate channels of campaign mobilization that piggybacked onto LDS church structures initially gave the church a layer of protection against public scrutiny. Even before the Proposition 8 campaign, observers of the LGBT civil rights movement had tracked close ties between the LDS Church and national anti-marriage equality organizations like the National Organization for Marriage. During the Yes on 8 campaign, church members were instructed to recognize ProtectMarriage.com as the authorized surrogate LDS campaign agency. ProtectMarriage.com organized a grassroots operational arm that was distinguished, on paper at least, from ecclesiastical structures, but which in fact piggybacked onto geographically organized ecclesiastical units, so wards. So regions of the campaign in the grassroots language were mapped onto stakes in the church institutional structure, and zip code supervisors to do the canvassing were assigned by wards. Regional directors and zip code supervisors were authorized to assign campaign responsibilities within their wards and stakes in a practice that piggybacked on the LDS ecclesiastical practice of assigning members callings. Financially, the church also deferred to and directed members to support ProtectMarriage.com. It did not make a direct major donation to the campaign, as it had in Alaska. Instead, it assisted with fundraising assessments and directed members to donate to ProtectMarriage.com only. Church members were advised to conduct the campaign in ways that might shield the church from scrutiny or deflect attention. LDS volunteers who did door-to-door voter identification were encouraged not to self-identify as Mormons. Some members regarded these instructions and the use of surrogates that piggybacked onto church structures confusing. Indeed, it's sort of the main utility of this sort of surrogate structure. You understand what I'm talking about? Like, here's the campaign grassroots structure, here's the ward structure where Mormons show up and organize, layered, distinguished on paper, but commingled. And sort of the main utility of this, it seems, was to provide sort of a plausible layer of protection against the church being identified as a major direct stakeholder. A few more observations. Third, the Yes on 8 campaign fostered private insider narratives that constructed protection of LDS temple ceilings as its object. So once again, this public-private split in the way Mormons narrate their realities. Within insider organizational channels, the way LDS people talked amongst themselves about the Yes on 8 campaign differed from the ways they talked about the campaign in public. While it's true that on both channels the scripted narrative was that a vote for Proposition 8 was a vote to protect marriage, LDS people narrated the Yes on 8 campaign as an urgent defense of temple marriage in particular. Insider LDS communications about Proposition 8 depicted marriage equality as an assault on the ability of the LDS Church to continue to perform temple marriages, constructing the campaign as a defense of the temple. In July 2008, Meridian magazine published from Protect Marriage grassroots director Gary Lawrence, who is LDS and whose firm Lawrence Research was contracted by the campaign, an article that framed the Proposition 8 campaign in Mormon theological terms as a sacred war in defense of religious agency. Quote, a defining moment, a tipping point, a critical battle in our existence. And I want you to mind this. This is not about those people. This is about our existence, right? A tipping point. On August 9th, 2008, Meridian published an article by Lawrence's grassroots co-director, Glenn Greener, presenting 9 talking points alleging that failure to pass Proposition 8 would result in government intrusions on religious liberties, including lawsuits against churches that refuse to perform same-sex marriages. Shortly thereafter, a redacted 6 consequences if Proposition 8 does not pass document created by Gary Lawrence went viral throughout Mormon organizational and kinship networks. What was not said explicitly in the 6 consequences document was elaborated in the insider narratives of the Mormon Yes on 8 campaign. Those who witnessed the campaign firsthand in California report that it was communicated by priesthood leaders in Sunday meetings and widely believed among LDS church members that the legalization of same-sex marriage would force the LDS church to marry gay couples and that the church would be forced to shut down its own temples rather than comply. Similar narratives were deployed among LDS church members in Arizona and Massachusetts when those states considered same-sex marriage legalization. Mormons generally did not incorporate their fear of a threat against temple marriage in their communications with non-Mormon potential voters because that would have contradicted instructions not to openly identify as LDS. But day-to-day member-to-member communications consistently telegraphed this threat in language coded to index the Mormon temple. For example, one zip code supervisor described door-to-door voter identification as a solemn duty. Another described phone banking as a responsibility with eternal consequences. The idea that the legalization of same-sex marriage would force conservative denominations to offer marriage to same-sex couples or face legal penalty was broadly discredited by experts writing in the mainstream media. Mormon supporters of marriage equality also sought to contest this tendentious interpretation, but their efforts were broadly disregarded because they did not reach LDS populations through trusted, recognized, institutional, and authorized surrogate channels. The siege-oriented undergrounding mentality insulated LDS populations from robust civil exchange with fellow citizens. There is no question that when discursive tactics of undergrounding were used during the Yes on 8 campaign, they effectively motivated and mobilized LDS people. But reactivating these old patterns of guardedness, siege mentality, opacity, and insider-outsider boundary maintenance also came perhaps at a cost to LDS credibility. In the weeks and months that followed the campaign, LDS and non-LDS activists documented the extent of church-backed LDS involvement in the campaign, including the large proportion of Yes on 8 money that came from LDS people, making up a small fraction of the California population. Because the church had successfully deflected attention from its own heavy investment in Proposition 8 by mobilizing insulated internal channels of communication, using surrogates to deflect attention, and fostering private siege narratives to motivate LDS public sphere participation, post-election documentation of Mormon participation in the campaign took on a sensational air as a drama of concealment and revelation. Or all of a sudden, it's revealed that Mormons had this huge hand, and it's revealed all of a sudden. Such coverage fostered a sense in the public of outing a cloaked but pervasive Mormon influence, hearkening back to and seemingly confirming 19th century stereotypes of Mormon deception and untrustworthiness. Let's see if my magic, oh, there it is. Okay, here's an image you may be familiar with. This is an image that circulated during the hearings at the time of the seating of Senator Reed Smoot in the early 20th century, the first LDS senator. A multi-year show trial was convened, as Kathleen Flake has brilliantly covered in her book, putting basically Mormons on trial to determine whether they're worthy to serve. And this image shows the Mormon hierarchy, and Smoot is the small puppet-like figure in its hands, and on the arm it says polygamy, murder of apostates, blood atonement. So there's a sense, it says the real objection to Smoot is the caption. And then here's the image from the film, The Mormon Proposition, the movie poster, The Mormon Proposition, 8, The Mormon Proposition. Notice the parallels here of the idea of a cloaked influence. Notice, too, how the pull quotes selected by the producers of 8, the movie, position Mormons as a population unwilling to participate in open dialogue. As much as I reject negative stereotypes of LDS people wherever they occur, these images point to some painful realities. Most Mormons were only marginally aware of the tactics of insularity, deflection, and careful management implemented by the grassroots Yes on 8 campaign. I mean, Yes on 8 activities were conducted in plain sight in LDS communities, and LDS people were encouraged to view themselves as part of a coalition to end same-sex marriage. Consequently, Mormons were unprepared for the sensationalistic outing of a Mormon underground or a Mormon influence, and bewildered by the activist response focusing on LDS participation, including temples by LGBT folks at LDS temples in California and beyond. Such demonstrations recursively confirmed the construction of the LDS temple as an emblem of besieged theocracy and heightened the sense among Mormons that LDS lifeways were under threat from a hostile secular world. Mormons were also seemingly unprepared for the idea that their disproportionate and carefully managed involvement in the Yes on 8 campaign would brand the church as a leading opponent of LGBT equality nationwide. All of these consequences highlight the general non-alignment between internal LDS discourse and public sphere discourse. Understanding the insularity, privacy, and residual theocracy of LDS communities is crucial to understanding Mormon participation in American political life. Mormons have not routinely mobilized on social conservative issues like abortion rights that have motivated other conservative Christian denominations. But if directed by LDS church leaders to mobilize on an issue that is perceived to impact LDS interests, they will do so with intensity. The primary site for these interventions has been on issues of gender, especially as they pertain to family definition, inasmuch as the power to create and bind families is a primary distinguishing feature of LDS theocracy. This pattern has held true for more than a century, from the political crisis over polygamy to the Equal Rights Amendment to Proposition 8. Even as we have transitioned from frontier theocracy to minority denominational status, Mormons have maintained amongst ourselves a strong sense of differentiation from and a residually martial disposition towards dominant society. A robust sense of our history, vibrant kinship networks, and oppositional identity are political assets to the Mormon tradition. Old patterns of undergrounding are the shadow side of our difference. How Mormon communities continue to manage this shadow side and what it costs us will be key determinants of Mormon participation in American politics in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, both Claudia and Joanna, for your papers, and we have time for robust discussion. Please.
Questions for Joanna. So you had mentioned at the end that there was kind of a backlash in public appeal, or just public perception when it was found out that the Latter-day Saints were so active in California. It's my belief that ballot issues like this are not a thing of the past, but are very much a thing of the future, including Minnesota in 2012. Even though we might not see a campaign like in California from the Latter-day Saints Church due to the backlash or whatever, do you think that the ground level of theological writing and things like that that were done by the church will cause the church in Minnesota to mobilize simply because that rhetoric's out there in public? Or is that going too far to say that, I mean, kind of get what I'm trying to get at here is, even that base was laid down in California, is that going to be similar for other states, do you think, or is that going to be...
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was, will we see this intensity of participation again, in other states? There's a contest in Minnesota that's approaching a ballot initiative. And, I think California is in some ways a unique space or a special space. I think, I forget who it was that said, I think David might have said that, the inside word is that the church felt it could make a difference in California. I mean, there's a strong multi-generational Mormon community in California, small but big enough to have sort of a critical mass. There's some patterns of wealth distribution among California Mormons that could be readily mobilized. I mean, the population is so much smaller in Minnesota that I don't think we are seeing this kind of mobilization. I mean, there have been several contests that have passed without us seeing mobilization as directed by the church rise to this level. So I don't know. I don't think that we'll see this again on ballot initiatives pertaining to marriage equality. But who knows?
Can I ask people to use the microphone if possible? If not, speak loudly. Sally?
Thank you very much. Is this loud enough?
Little.
No? Maybe if I stand.
Joe is going to help. Here we go.
Thank you. Of course, the LDS Church isn't alone in connecting same-sex marriage to a threat to the religion. But I wondered whether I could ask both Claudia and Joanna whether they see a connection in the reaction to same-sex marriage in California and beyond as in any way replaying polygamy in an additional way, which is that so many commentators have said legalize same-sex marriage and what's next? Polygamy. And I'm wondering whether there isn't a layer there that is more unique to Mormonism than just connecting it to ceremonies in temples. Thank you.
Well, I would say certainly there is a connection, but what I see as the common denominator is this kind of conservative fear. What if? You know, if this happens, then you list a whole list of possible results that will come. And, you know, how many times have people that have been in the trenches like me heard, it's not what you're doing now, it's what you might do down the line. And so I think it's very similar to that. We just read the future ahead, and it doesn't necessarily come to pass.
I mean, there may be something to this idea I think you're trying to raise, Sally, that there's this sort of allergy to polygamy in the community, like a very complicated, contradictory relationship to polygamy that still persists in Mormon culture. You know, there are folks, you know, mainstream members who believe polygamy may be the order of the afterlife. You know, that's just a part of us that's still with us. And at the same time, you know, during the Yes on 8 campaign, you'd find younger people who really didn't know about the church's polygamous past because it has been sort of edited out of curriculum. Believe it or not, there are young people who just, this is not a part of their awareness. Young Mormon people. Yeah, people are nodding their heads, yeah. Young people are nodding their heads. They didn't tell you. Yeah, no, but and so I think this allergy, this highly conflicted relationship to the polygamous past, sort of led to really strange moments during the campaign, intense moments where Mormons were, you know, faced with commentators who would say, "But you all had the queerest form of marriage going in the 19th century." Who, us? What are you talking about? Or young Mormons espousing the parade of horribles line of reasoning, you know, which is, oh, next is X, Y, and Z. Polygamy's awful, from young Mormon people, right?
I'll just say my name for those who are here this morning. I'm Miss Alice LaBrie, and this question, I'm a great honoring of the LSD community. So this question comes asking for information. I'm dyslexic too. Forgive me. You know, in the Foreign Service, I was in Turkey, so I learned about the Harem. I would like it made clear to me what the heck reasoning the government used from a legal point of view to outlaw polygamy. I personally believe in it. I wouldn't mind being part of a polygamous marriage. Take some of the weight off me. So, I'm sorry, I don't mean to make light of this, but what was the government's reasoning for disallowing it? Do you know?
Maybe Sally?
Sally,
do you want the question was, what was the government's reasoning for outlawing polygamy in the 19th century? You have the expert right here.
It may take me a whole book to answer that. I think it had to do especially with democracy, the idea that one man shouldn't get lots. It's one man, one vote, one wife. I think it also had to do with a sense that women were not actually voluntarily participating and that they couldn't get out. I could go on, but those are the two that seem most relevant to this conversation.
What was society saying at that time? Were they up in arms about it?
Society.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
As we've heard today, it was considered really the form of sexual enslavement of women and very tightly connected to racial slavery as well in rhetoric all around the country.
I guess everybody saw Sandra Day O'Connor's quip yesterday that of these two potential nominees for the Republican nomination. One of them was a practicing polygamist, and he wasn't even a Mormon.
Other questions? Yes, Russell.
I wanted to, kind of building on the discussion about women in polygamy in history, I wanted to make a connection between some of the information that you shared, Claudia, and an argument that Sally brought up towards the end of her presentation this morning. And that was, with the rise of kind of lawyers as a class and legal thinking in the territory of Utah towards the end of the polygamy struggle, and as Utah developed its position as a state, women who had been so very, very active in both the defense of polygamy and then the attack on polygamy, found themselves marginalized, found themselves set aside. And so as you have studied 19th century Mormon feminism, I wonder, was there much vocalized expression of regret at the passing of polygamy? Because this was their opportunity to be vocal proponents, to be strong voices within the public sphere, and as the debate moved in a different direction, did they feel that power was being taken away from them, that voice was being taken away from them? And did they say so if they felt that way?
I don't have a lot of evidence on that myself, but there's at least that one comment from a woman who was there when polygamy was voted out in the tabernacle, and I voted for it because there was nothing else to do, even knowing it would make me not a wife again and homeless possibly, and with my children just set aside. So I think the real victims of this, as Sally said today, a lot of the real victims, I don't think she mentioned specifically, were the plural wives that are just thrown to the dogs. I mean, you read their individual stories and they don't complain about not having a political position. They complain about not having a house and a husband and things like that. It was a terrible wrench for society and for these women who'd done all the things they were supposed to do for all those years against all kinds all kinds of effort by others. Here they are just lost. Yeah, it's a tragic situation, I think.
Jan.
After the reaction to yes or nay, I was interviewed on TV, and I said that I thought the brethren, that is the general authorities, were surprised at the reaction. Do you think that was put on, or do you think they really were surprised at the reaction?
I should think so. It was really, I was in California then, and it was a striking situation.
And some of the, and we just don't have enough documentation. There's just not enough documented historical sources yet available. I hope they will be. One of the narratives that circulates in California is that that folks at some of the regional and kind of the grassroots, the campaign people in California sort of took the ball and ran with it in a way that may have exceeded expectations from Salt Lake. So the grassroots organized, the statewide professional grassroots personnel who were Mormons developed plans that may have exceeded expectations when the first presidency issued a letter saying, please do all that you can. So that's a narrative that's circulating, but again, it's very difficult to document without access to archives.
Well, that's true, but please do all that you can. Seems to me so coded that it is a part of the underground.
This is a question for Joanna. How does the church manage to maintain its inside story in the age of information when there's so many access, so many sources of information? How do they shield church members?
This is a very timely question. Just in the last week, we've seen articles in Reuters, and Peggy's written about it for the Salt Lake Tribune, about how access to information in the digital age is creating a new landscape of knowledge about church history. And, I'm nobody, and I've gotten email from parents who say, my son Googled something and landed in a site about Joseph Smith and polygamy, and what he read made him disaffiliate from the tradition. So there's a real moment unfolding, and it's going to intensify with the scrutiny of the campaign year ahead, when aspects of Mormon history that have been very carefully managed for, I believe, people who believe they have best intentions, are colliding with the Google era. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all unfolds. I mean, it's tricky and it's in process right now.
That's actually sort of a precursor to my question. Claudia, I was really struck when you used your two hands and said, well, on one hand, we've got, this church, and this is what we believe. This is what we say we believe. And on the other hand, this is how I feel, and this is what I believe. And I'm curious, the two of you, this is a question for both of you, how much of what we are dealing with now, and maybe even now, meaning Mormonism, because we are a young religion, but there are some aspects, like you said, Joanna, Google is new, and all of these things that were sort of these new dynamics. Are there religious traditions, communities, are there histories that you're aware of, and that you sort of, that Mormons that you're aware of are looking to say, hey, they navigated it this way? And how much of it is new for us as Mormon people, and how much of this is the age-old, this is just life? These are our struggles as human beings. So I'm curious about that. It's hugely
You take that first.
No, you.
Well, all right, I'll talk fast, and then Joanna can give us the right answer. But we've been reading for our class in Contemporary Mormonism, Arben Moss's piece about his updating of The Angel in the Beehive, where he talks about how the great pressure to retrench, that is to become more conservative, has led up in the last 2 decades. And he asks why, and he says he thinks it's because the tension between being a Mormon and living in the contemporary world is just a little too much right now and has to be relieved. And so it's very interesting to look at that along with a number of specific issues. How do you feel about the infallibility of the prophet? How do you believe about behavior on all kinds of things? What about the historicity of the Book of Mormon? Because those and many other subjects have gone back and forth along the spectrum, and we do have in the church a wide spectrum of belief on all of these things. Now, you asked specifically what things. Well, it seems to me that the church historical department has now done the job on Mountain Meadows Massacre. I don't know if there's anything left to be found. They have certainly done an exhaustive search. I have heard that plans, or at least discussions about doing the same thing with polygamy, to explore everything, and then lay it all out. Things like that are in the works. And we certainly seen that piece that Peggy did the other day, where Marlon Jensen was talking to Phil Barlow's class, and how he said that knowing many people were disturbed about things they discovered, that they were going to make an effort to disseminate much more of that information much earlier. So those are the things I'd say. What do you have to add?
I think a great deal about Kathleen Flake's narrative about Mormonism moving from sort of a theocracy and then taking on forms of denominationalism, right? Just another American denomination as part of its price of entry into 20th century life. And I think that transition is ongoing. I think there's still a residual sense of theocracy, and that Mormons haven't necessarily settled into a sense that we're just, like you were sort of inferring, we're just another religious minority, right? We have experiences like any other people of faith. You transition into different stages of faith over the course of your life, of course. There's still something different Mormons like to reserve about ourselves, and not sort of just join the plurality of American faiths. And it'll be interesting to see how we continue to manage this transition over the course of the 21st century. And I'm always thrilled when I hear that, I think the church has done a great job addressing Mountain Meadows. I frankly, as someone who knows Native American history, always scratch my heads when people get up in too much, well, I won't even say that. I mean, massacres happen in the American West a lot, and it's less that these issues, I think any of them individually are so destructive to us, but the way that we try to manage them, and people know when we are trying to manage our information. People know. People can sense that. We have more to fear in the way we handle our own issues than in the issues themselves.